Hello and welcome to Inspire Book Talk. I'm delighted to say that today's guest is none other than best-selling novelist Tracy Chevalier, who's going to be talking to us about her most recent book, A Single Thread. Tracy, welcome. Lovely to see you.
You too. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Thank you for joining us. Now, we were just saying how much there is to talk about this book, and I'm going to try and focus on a few of the things that really interest me. And the most interesting facet of it for me was the world of the unmarried woman in the 1930s, the spinster, the surplus woman. And I wondered if you were, if that was an era you were particularly keen on looking at, if that was the first thing about the book that came to you.
The first thing was actually about cathedrals. I had always wanted to write a cathedral novel. I wanted to set a book in and around a cathedral. And I chose Winchester because it had a lot of really good stories attached to it. But when I was visiting and looking around and thinking about what I was going to focus on, I discovered these cushions and kneelers that had been embroidered by a group of volunteer women in the 1930s. And they just struck me. At the time, I didn't know why, but since I've written the book, I've started to understand better that I think I was looking for something in the cathedral that was actually made by women rather than men. You know, everything in there, the stained glass, the carving, the whole building itself, it's 900 years old. And so back then, it would have been all master carvers and stained glass makers. It would have been all men. But the cushions, they're very beautiful and unusual, very brightly colored in a dark space in the choir stalls of the cathedral. They're the one thing we know was made by women, and I think that was what appealed to me. And this group of women, they made them in the 1930s. I started researching what it's like to live as a woman in the 1930s, and I came across this, what you mentioned, the label surplus woman. This was a label that came out, the newspapers used it in 1921. A census was taken in 21 after World War I, and they discovered there were almost 2 million more women than men in the UK at that time because of the losses during the war primarily. And the newspapers were horrified by this and said, oh, these surplus women, what are we going to do with them? Like they're a big problem, a big social problem. And in a way, they sort of were, because society was not set up for single women. It was the expectation was that women were going to marry. And if they didn't marry, there wasn't much they could do. Higher education was still pretty closed to them. And they could be governesses or nurses or teachers or typists, but not a whole lot more. And you couldn't really live very easily on the salary of those professions. So it was a problem for the women too. And a lot of women who thought that they were going to marry weren't able to. So what were they going to do? And this was, I read about this, and they were referred to so condescendingly and pityingly. And I thought, I want to write a novel about a surplus woman who manages to have a good life, to establish an independent life for herself. Because most of the time, surplus women were forced to rely on their families financially. And they often lived at home with their parents. They looked after their parents when they're elderly. And oddly enough, since the book came out, so many readers have said to me, oh yeah, we had a surplus woman in our family. Or I remember my aunt or my great aunt who, they always looked after the kids or sat in the corner and tried not to make too much fuss because their lives were so precarious and they were so dependent on their families. And I thought, wow. And so this is a kind of more positive way of looking at what a woman could do with her life at that time.
Yeah, and your heroine Violet she's not a shrinking Violet by any means, but she is diminished in the eyes of society by that notion of her as a surplus. And I was interested quite early on in the book. Violet herself is aware that a lot of the people who look down upon her are other women. And I always think that's very interesting because there are lots of things about the book which are about all sorts of women being ingenious and taking control and being intelligent. But a lot of the time they're thwarted or almost thwarted by other women. And there's that whole sort of turkeys voting for Christmas element of women wanting to maintain certain social standards that are actually detrimental to them.
Yeah.
And trying to enforce it upon other women. And I think that's really interesting, and it's really brave, because I think a lot of writers try and avoid that, but it is still a truth, I think.
Yes, I think that this is a dirty secret that most people would not want to say, but I think women are way more judgmental of women than men are. Women notice other women's size and what they wear and what their hair is like. Men, honestly, goes over their heads, most of them. And but women are way more aware. And one of the scenes in the book, Violet moves from Southampton, where she's been living with her mother. It's her childhood home. She's 38 years old, and she finally moves out. And she moves 12 miles away to Winchester and becomes a typist there. And she's looking for community to join. And I was fascinated by the communities that grow up around cathedrals. And one of them was this embroidery community. She ends up joining it and making cushions and kneelers with this group of women. And many of them are married, some aren't. And there's a scene where they're all sitting around chatting as they're working. And she notices that the married women are paid attention to more than the unmarried women. Like, the unmarried women take a back seat and just don't say much, don't speak up, and the married women dominate. And somebody I know who read the book, who is single, said to me, "How did you know, Tracy? Because I am married, so I don't really have the single life." And she said, "It's still like that. When I go to dinner parties, as the singleton, as Bridget Jones would say, I feel like I'm not paid as much attention to as a married woman." And I was astonished by this when I heard this, that like in 2020 it'd still be like this. And she said, "No, there's just something about it that maybe the women feel more supported because they've got a man there. I don't know, but it was kind of shocking to hear that was still the case."
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's certainly in terms of observation and women noticing. Violet says no man would notice if your hair slides in the wrong place or your lipstick's not put on straight. But yeah, it's women looking and trying to make everyone else keep this standard, which of course is unfair, and which of course Violet herself is somebody who she needs to conform externally. She needs to work. She needs to support herself. She can't step out of line, but she has all the needs and the desires and the wishes of a contemporary person. She's not. I think you make her very, very contemporary. So she has occasional liaisons with nameless men. But she can't possibly bring that out into society, into the open. It's a terrible, shameful thing. Whereas the double standard with men is operating all the time, and I think that still strikes a lot of chords in terms of what women are and are not allowed to do.
But we're making this sound like she has a completely negative experience, and not at all. She does develop a group of friends and who are very supportive and mostly, in fact, I think I'm going to read a scene where she meets one of them.
Brilliant.
Yes, and this is she's just a little bit of ways through the book. She goes into the cathedral. She really likes going to the cathedral evensong, and she meets a woman there in amongst a few of the cushions and kneelers that have been made. And I'm just going to read that little bit about her deciding that she's going to take part.
Okay.
Like most smaller services, evensong was held in the choir. The choir boys, with their scrubbed, mischievous faces, sat in one set of stall benches, the congregants in the other, with any overflow in the adjacent presbytery seats. Violet suspected evensong was considered frivolous by regular churchgoers compared with Sunday morning services, but she preferred the lighter touch of music to the booming organ, and the shorter, simpler sermon to the hectoring morning one. She did not pray or listen to prayers. Prayers had died in the war alongside George and Lawrence and a nation full of young men. But when she sat in the choir stalls, she liked to study the carved oak arches overhead, decorated with leaves and flowers and animals and even a green man. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see the looming enormity of the nave, But sitting here with the boys' ethereal voices around her, she felt safe from the void that at times threatened to overwhelm her. Sometimes, quietly and unostentatiously, she cried. One Sunday afternoon, Violet slipped in late to evensong, just as a visiting dean was giving the sermon. When she went to sit, she moved a kneeler that had been placed on the chair, then held it in her lap and studied it. It was a rectangle about 9 by 12 inches with a mustard-colored circle in the center, surrounded by a mottled field of blue. The design was of a bouquet of branches with checker-capped acorns amongst the blue-green foliage. The colors were surprisingly bright, the pattern cheerful and unchurch-like. She placed the kneeler on the floor and glanced at those around her, each with a central circle of knots or flowers on a blue background. There were not yet enough embroidered kneelers for every chair, and the rest had the usual unmemorable hard lozenges of red and black felt. The new embroidered ones lifted the tone of the presbytery, giving it a color and a sense of designed purpose. At the service's end, Violet picked up the kneeler to look at it again, smiling as she traced with her finger the checkered acorns. A hovering presence made her look up. A woman about her age stood in the aisle next to her, staring at the kneeler Violet held. She was wearing a forest green coat and a matching hat, with feathers tucked in the band. Despite her modish attire, she did not have the appearance of being modern, but looked rather as if she had stepped aside from the flow of the present. Her hair was not waved. Her pale gray eyes seemed to float in her face. "Sorry, would you mind if I—" She reached out to flip over the kneeler and reveal the dark blue canvas underside. "I just like to look at it when I'm here. It's mine, you see." She tapped on the border. Violet squinted. Stitched there were the initials and a year. DJ, 1932. Violet watched her gazing at her handiwork. "How long did it take you to make it?" 2 months. I had to unpick bits a few times. These kneelers may be used in the cathedral for centuries, and so they must be made correctly from the start. Ars long, vita brevis. Violet thought back to her Latin at school. Art is long, life short. Yes. Violet could not imagine the kneeler being there for hundreds of years. The war had taught her not to assume that anything would last, even something as substantial as a cathedral, much less a mere kneeler. She wondered if the builders of the cathedral 900 years ago had thought of her standing under their arches, next to their thick pillars, lit by their stained glass, a woman in 1932, living and worshiping so differently from how they did. They would not have conjured up Violet Speedwell, that seemed certain. She put out a hand as DJ set her kneeler on a chair and made to move off. "Are you a member of the cathedral embroiderers?" DJ paused. "Yes." "If one wanted to contact them, how?" "There is a sign on the notice board in the porch about the meetings." She looked at Violet directly for a moment, then nodded and filed out after the other congregants.
Thank you, that was lovely. And there we have lots of the beautiful detail, the really sensory detail that you've put into the embroidery itself. And I know I read an article in which you said you actually made some of the items that Violet made, which is taking research to quite a degree. That's very impressive.
I did, and they're downstairs, or I'd run and get them. They at one point Violet makes a spectacles case for her mother, and I made it as I was writing the scene where she gives it to her, and then she makes a needle case for her niece. And for me, making them is a way of connecting myself with the characters, and also to try to figure out how to write accurately about the process. So feeling the wool and threading the needle and doing the different patterns and stuff and the different stitches, I got a sense of I wanted it to feel authentic, what I was writing. I often do this with books. a few books ago, I wrote a novel called The Last Runaway, where the main character is a quilter, and I learned to quilt in order to be able to write about it more accurately. In fact, I still quilt because I really liked
Do
it.
you? And was it The Lady and the Unicorn? There's tapestry, and did you actually have? Did you have a go at that point? You're a bit of
I
a
had
one-woman craft revivalist band, aren't you?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I went to, there's a wonderful place called Westdean College in Sussex that has a tapestry studio, which is recreating some medieval tapestries using the old ways. And they let me, I watched them for hours, and they let me sit and do a little bit of it. And
Brilliant.
other things, I mean, it's not just crafts, it's things like, I wrote a novel about Mary Anning called The Fossil Hunter in Lyme Regis, called Remarkable Creatures. And for that book, I spent hours on the beach hunting for fossils and found some.
Did you?
And
Okay, that's
just
good.
I needed literally to get the blue lias clay under my fingers, so I'd be able to describe it accurately and with authority. Because when you write a novel that's set somewhere that nobody knows about, or that's in the past, I have to create a world that you believe in as the reader. And in order to do that, I have to do a lot of research. And part of my research usually involves doing some of the things that my characters do.
Sure. It was all completely authentic and clearly written as from an expert point of view, and it really did help us visualize as well. And something it reminded me of very strongly. I think it was A.S. Byatt who described writing a novel as being like weaving a tapestry, and that was it. The craft of it was like taking these threads of stories, these threads of characters, and weaving them through. And obviously it's a very obvious metaphor, and you have a very literal canvas that lots of the story was happening on, but it just really, especially your comment that, or in fact, the teacher, Miss Pessel, says to Violet, oh, you've got to be careful about what's on the back as well. You've got to make that look beautiful too. And so I think I was hyper aware of the fact that there was the odd character that I knew was going to come up again, and you realised was in the background all the time, and then would come through and change the texture of it. So it worked beautifully as a metaphor.
True. It's so. I often think when I'm writing a first draft of a book that as I'm going, it's like I create a character and leave the thread of them dangling out all the way through it, and then I figure out, am I going to use them later? And I'm going to weave them back into the story. And that happened absolutely in the first scene of the book. Violet goes to a service at the cathedral, and she sits next to a woman named Gilda, who at first I didn't name her, because if you name a character, little tip, if a character is named in a book, they're going to come back, because you're not going to give a name to somebody who doesn't really matter. You'll just say the woman I met in the green hat or whatever. But Gilda, I first thought, is she going to come back? Well, maybe in a small way. Well, I'll leave that thread dangling and see. And then Gilda ends up playing a really important part of the book. See, as you can tell, I don't actually plan it all the way out before I start writing. Yeah. I kind of know the arc of the story. I know where my character is going to end up emotionally, where they are at the start and where they are at the end, how they've been changed, but I don't actually know the plot of exactly what's going to happen. And so I don't know all of the secondary characters. And one of the joys of writing is actually creating a character, giving them a name, and thinking, oh yeah, okay, how am I going to use Gilda Hill? Well, okay, I think she's going to be one of the women, single women who is in the embroidery group. And if that's the case, so why is she single? Well, maybe there's a particular reason for that. I know, yes, and that would give a sense of Violet seeing different sorts of lives, the way people live differently, and how she can create her own. And so it all kind of builds up like that.
The organic process coming through, as well as the kind of craft. But it was just such a perfect metaphor for a book which focuses so much embroidery, and I enjoyed seeing those threads coming through. And Gilda and DJ are some of the less conformist women that Violet meets and that help her on her personal journey. And again, with great ingenuity, they manage to subvert what's happening in society. They manage to live their own lives without causing too much scandal, and in a way that's really useful and industrious. And I thought that they were really commendable. I thought that the heroism of Violet is the way she maintains her integrity and goes through that goes through all of her experiences and stays herself, but a stronger version of herself. So I got a strong sense of that. The only thing that was a slight dread as I was approaching the end of the book and seeing that there were all sorts of contentments and happinesses she'd found, was that I was hyper aware that it was the 1930s and we knew what was coming. And I wonder if was that in your mind when you were writing it? I think interwar novels really always have that air of doom about them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of the difficulties of writing an interwar novel, and probably why writers tend to go to one war or the other. First of all, they seem more obviously dramatic, but also it's really difficult because I, the writer, and you, the reader, know that World War II is coming, but they don't know. And for me, it was a challenge not to give them any foresight. Well, one character, Arthur Knight,
Yes.
has some foresight. Like he reads about, in the middle of the book, Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany in 1933. And that's is a real turning point in history, but you don't know a turning point is a turning point when you're living it. And but Arthur has a little bit more knowledge, understanding that this is not good than others. And this is not a political novel, but and I don't want to spoil anything, but there is something on the cushions that is quite surprising. And it is something I discovered as I was researching the book. And I thought, okay, I have got to explain this in some way. And of course, it's the 1930s. So maybe I can bring that in. So I do, but I hope relatively subtly. And it's mostly through Arthur, who sees the political situation for what it is. But I've had several readers say, could we have a sequel, please? Because, you know, it ends in a certain way, and I want to know what happens to the characters in World War II, because it ends in 1934. And the thing about this book is that the shadow of World War I is really cast very greatly over this, even though it starts in 1932, which is 14 years after the war is finished. Violet lost her fiance and her older brother in the war, and her mother's never really recovered from losing her son. Violet is a surplus woman because she lost her fiance, and so these things continue to vibrate and resonate through all the way to the 1930s. And it reminds me of something that I was so surprised by. Being American, we had a very different experience of World War II. And there wasn't rationing in the same way. And it was only when I came over here to live when I was in my 20s, and I discovered that rationing after World War II, like rationing of butter and sugar and eggs and stuff, well, I think sugar was till 1954.
Yeah.
It was 9 years after World War II ended. And so these wars really cast a long shadow. I mean, that's what is so fascinating about history for me, is seeing how it affects and continues to affect us. So, you know, just talking about what we're living through now, which is like living through a historical moment with the COVID pandemic. I keep wondering, how is this going to affect us in a year's time, in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time? How are we going to be changed by this? Are we going to be changed by this? Are we going to have that vaccine and then all get back to normal? I don't know, and I don't think so. I think something's going to shift, but I don't know what it is. And that's why it's very hard. I feel for my peers who are contemporary novelists who are trying to figure out to write about this. Is not easy when you're in the middle of it and you don't know what's going to happen, and you feel like what you write now might end up being dated in a year or two.
Yeah.
Whereas at least I have the historical perspective. I'm writing about, like right now, I'm writing about 16th century Venice. Actually, the plague is there as well.
Yes.
At least
yes.
I know what happened afterwards, you know, so it's easier for me to have some perspective.
Yeah, you can say, I'll write about this in 20 years' time when you can actually look back. And yeah, I think Martin Amis said there'll be no proper COVID novel for 3 or 4 years. Everyone's got to digest it, and I think there is a point in that. I could go on, Tracy. I could ask you so many more things, but I'm going to have to stop. You mentioned Arthur. He was a lovely character, and I wanted to talk about bell ringing, but we could be here all afternoon. But there's so much in the novel. It's so rich, and it's such a satisfying thing to read. And I do feel I've learned, particularly you were talking about the little embroidery secret that we won't say. That works in so many ways, because it's also a part of the book where you think you know people, and then suddenly you think maybe there's someone's character that you've completely misjudged, and then you find out. So it's used as a really interesting device, as well as being something I had no idea about at all. So it's always nice.
I think you have to go to Winchester now and see the cushions for yourself and look for the secret.
I will have to, and I love the idea that people can actually go to the cathedral and walk where Violet walked, and find the friezes and look at the bell tower. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
So,
and you can go up in the bell chamber. I mean, I feel like we're doing Arthur a disservice. There's a whole part of this that's just about bell ringing, and I spent a lot of time up in that bell chamber. But I wanted to balance out the embroidery, the women's group, with a male group, which is the male bell ringers. And Violet learns a lot from both of those, so it's a kind of balancing act.
Yeah. And Violet's a great character. She's so open-minded and strong. So she's superb. So thank you ever so much for talking to her. It's been an absolute pleasure. I know our readers will be delighted. And as I said, the book is being borrowed madly and downloaded, and it's really popular. So thank you for taking the time to talk to us. It's been really lovely to talk to you.
Thank you for having me.